Good evening, Jokoistas. Good evening, welcome. It's good to be with you again for a Joko conversation. I am Brother Youssef with my partner who will introduce herself in a moment. I am myself a poet, a professor of composition, creative writing, literature, scholar of cultural studies with concentrations in Africana studies and media studies, and um, attuned to narratives. Right? A long time enjoyer of stories. Um, and we'll talk about that a little tonight. Uh, the stories that are brought to us by General Mills.
Right, brought to us by
My
our
partner, my comrade, Tasha.
corporate keepers. And hello, everybody. Um, I know this time switch that was this spontaneous kind of time switch that it looks like we will be doing, keeping up at 6 o'clock rather than the 7 o'clock, and got to keep putting it out there, and folk our right little group of people who keep up with us can find us again. Um, and we look forward to that, and we really look forward to folks at some point jumping into the conversation because it is a conversation. Um, and it would be wonderful for anybody viewing to hop on and comment, and participate in the discussion in that way. We got that once or twice, and it was really great. It was really delightful. Um, so just sending that out there. Come on and share. Um, and so we always start and take the time at the beginning to acknowledge our personal lineages, our uh, personal ancestral lineages, right, that make us the particular kinds of vehicles for liberation work that we are, in terms of values, in terms of exposures, in terms of uh, idiosyncrasies and family narratives and stories and all of the things that go into the pot to inspire you to, you know, be on the be on the side of taking care of the people and all of the different societies living on the planet, human and non-human. And we always salute our the ancestors whose names we know, whose names we don't know, who had the audacity, the creativity, the courage, the uh, all of the energies required to conceive and implement resistance against this machine of exploitation and social destruction and all of the things, all of the reasons that resistors resist and all of the things that resistors resist. We know that there are collective um, ancestors in every group on the planet who has contributed to the resistance to that effect over the last 700 some years. um, and we always acknowledge that we do this work, we keep in the forefront, we do not forget that any liberation work we do on behalf of our particular group we do at the hospitality of the ancestors and the peoples who of the First Nations of what some of them call Turtle Island. Um, we do that at their hospitality. Okay, we do not forget where we are and what the primary struggle, the primary contradiction here is the settler colonial state. Um, and with that, I say that with all, gratitude and joy and um, just, yeah, the joy of being a part of this resistance and this pushback and this work to bring to like reestablish an ethos of justice and human uh peaceability, right? And this is not in naming uh past societies and other kinds of societies that we can look at in some kind of romantic place that was above all of the human uh all of the human what is the word I'm looking for? Frailties specifically of injustice and abuse. You know, it's a part of all narratives and the ways to overcome it, right? But we certainly can. It is in our witness, right? Um, that societies have been much more effective in managing the level of gross abuse and the managing the level of exploitation, cruelty. There's, in our, it's not, excuse me, um, far from us in our memory, um, and certainly in the memory and lore of our parent generation. For folks in Yusuf and my age bracket, a time when people felt quite comfortable to wander a city or wander a community at any hours of the night, who felt quite comfortable to, the lore of the unlocked door community, so that kind of what ubiquitous love tribe, ubiquitous human trust and
Mhm.
communalism is not some far-fetched idea. It's
Mhm.
very close to the fetch and literally in our memory. And so um, we can and we will and we are having a just world. And all that being said, we're picking up our conversation this evening uh, about the right's use of uh, culture and the evidence in cultural product of the reactionary politic, of the reactionary uh, will to power. And I'll say that much. And Yusuf, why don't you go ahead and pick it
Well,
up, get us back to the conversation.
well, shout out to the ubiquitous live love tribe. Ubiquitous love tribe you referenced there. Um, Group of young artists, creatives. Music, spoken word, MCs. Yeah, uh,
Hmm.
multi-ethnic, multi-racial vibe.
Hmm.
Once based at Santa Monica College. And
Hmm.
shout out to Ubiquitous Love Tribe. Yes,
Hmm.
that was well chosen. Uh, the yeah yeah. Anyway, though, yes, the cult. This cultural moment, right? That we're in. This moment we're in. This kind of this fascistic moment. this this time of of that sector of the ruling class, consolidating power in a particular way, and not doing something not unusual in the history of Western republics, right? Devolving
Mhm.
into something like a dictatorship. The
Mhm. Hmm.
But it's been coming, right? It's this is this what we're getting the bitter fruits of the seeds laid down in the mid 1960s,
Hmm.
and with the backlash in the 1960s, right? And um, you know the
Mhm.
you know the conservative movement
Mhm.
and all of its its various constituent parties and sectors began to regroup and reconcile, do their assessment, reconsolidate. Um, as the world is changing around them, there was already clearly backlash, right, and um,
Mhm.
racialized resentment, um, in the mid '60s, and certainly the how should I say? Well, the cleverness, the opportunism
Mhm.
to redraw the electoral map, as it were, right? And they
Mhm.
knew that they were, or as Johnson said, right, President Johnson, that signing the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Democrats were going to lose the South, which had
Mhm.
voted a Democrat. And um that happened right away, right? That backlash, right? The South gradually became,
Mhm.
um, I want to say kind of immediately, but also gradually, right? Maybe a state at a time, sort of, right? But became the
Mhm.
heartland of Republican politics, or at least Republican electoral dominance.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but all already reactionary, though, reacting to the civil rights movement, the related movements, um, that the discourse of liberation, the
Mhm.
critique of the traditional patriarchal, um, Judeo-Christian social structure,
Mhm.
that and again, that language of women's liberation, gay liberation, um, a Black Power movement that's talking about liberation, a Chicano movement, Puerto Rican independence movement, and of course, there, and the world is in revolution. And so they're on their heels, but they're also, that so the politics of resentment and
Mhm.
backlash. And just
Mhm.
as a brief example, already in California, which we know has the reputation as the very liberal state, and in the context of U.S.
Mhm.
politics, it is. But we also know how conservative it is, right? Living in California, growing up in California,
Mhm.
What Orange County means, San Diego County, right? All that rural space between the Los Angeles area and the San Francisco Bay Area, right? And where
Mhm.
everybody's concentrated, right? And
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
so already in the 1960s, right? I'm not I forget the exact year, the early 60s though, 62 maybe,
Mhm.
63, 61. The Rumfeld Act, I believe, if I'm getting it right, but the Fair Housing Act passed in California. The
Mhm.
Fair Housing Act passed in California, that within a couple of years, I think maybe 1964,
Mhm.
through the proposition.
Mhm.
method. It
Mhm.
was repealed, right? Because white California was not having it. There was, I mean, so there was already backlash, right? It's my point, right? All backlash is already set in, right? Um, Ronald Reagan becomes the
Mm.
governor of California,
Mm.
after Pat Brown. The
Mhm.
So we've been on our way to where we are in this current political climate, and for the longest, um, the reactionary elements in the society, conservative elements in the society, have been attacking education, attacking the legal profession, lawyers, have been attacking the press, right? So we're like reaching this. That's why I say this kind of fruition of those
Mhm.
seeds that were already being planted, and I'm bringing that up because one of their targets, right, is broadly speaking the media and the so-called corrupting influence of the media and the
Mhm.
bias of the media, the liberal bias of the media, all this, right?
Mhm.
Where they have worked in partnership so effectively.
Mhm.
Um, it's always it's an
Mhm.
interesting discourse, right? It's
Mhm.
because a lot of that liberal media, what they're objecting to is
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
reformist attitude, right? The efforts
Mhm.
to save the empire,
Mhm.
as right, by bringing some people in, or at least creating the illusion, right, through the storytelling, including
Mhm.
the storytelling of the commercials.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
this idealized vision of America, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
that rarely matches the real lives of Americans,
Mhm.
but how ends up becoming the common sense of the population. Because if that makes because they're constantly immersed in it, um, and then we wonder why various types of mental and emotional illness and disturbance are so epidemic in the United States, right? The levels of low, what, how should I say, or maybe I should say how widespread low level depression is, for example, right?
Mhm.
Functional depression.
Mhm.
Um, how often, people, how much, average people are living with, levels of anxiety, um, etc. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
anyway, yeah,
Mhm.
uh, they're actually, they're complicit.
Mhm.
And in many ways, the liberals are just as responsible for where we are, because they have not at any point actually, put up the kind of fight necessary, um,
Mhm.
because they're in agreement on
Mhm.
um, ultimately, what, financial policy, right? As Nancy Pelosi said, we're capitalists,
Mhm.
and certainly, um,
Mhm.
international policy, right? The ruling
Mhm.
class,
Mhm.
even if they,
Mhm.
switch focus, it's still the what is it the doctrine of full spectrum dominance, land, air, sea, space, cyberspace.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, yeah, and this as before we got on, we were talking a bit about how the shaping and development of consumer culture figures into countering insurgency, you know, and you were saying, well, yes, the purpose of containing political dissent and containing, um, when we say we want to maintain the status quo, there's a status quo to be maintained. It is the capacity of elites to maintain their wealth positioning,
Mhm.
maintain their, it probably hardly needs to be added power,
Mhm.
as if these are distinct
Mhm.
things,
Mhm.
at
Mhm.
all, you know.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and looking at that part. So even when you have, I think it's fair to say, um, in that 60s, 70s space, I think something shifts in the 80s, but in that
Mhm.
70s space, right? Part of in terms of I guess it's proper to say, ideological clarity of the resistors. There is a popularization, a
Mhm.
resistant attitude, not all of which was fleshed out with
Mhm.
ideological clarity, not that it was by any means was what worthless or ineffective or what have you, or not meaningful, because as we're talking about the symbolic environment, the symbol of the afro, the black is beautiful piece and the black power movement that gets contained in a afro symbol, in a afro comb symbol with a solidarity
Mhm.
fist, um is powerful symbolism, and it has endured. But again, ideological clarity. So when you talk about um the uh uh failure of liberals to actually represent any kind of deviation from the system of dominance and the system of exploitation and from this system, you know also, um in terms of people power and the mass mind that had to be corralled,
Mhm.
and contained toward assimilation, away from anti-establishmentarianism and further inquiry into that, and pointed back toward, a value system and a right, which you'll talk about in a minute, um, that that supports the capitalist and imperialist agenda, and supports maintaining, the elites in their positions. But um, again, part of the reason why that corralling works, right, is that it has to do with that consumer culture and the effectiveness of the that mediated value system, the lore, the effectiveness of selling and promoting a new value system. So we go from um, um, Good Times, we go from, I can't remember the family, Evans, to the Huxtables. We go
Mhm.
from Never Mind, Do We Ever See? Well, you always talk about Michael as the what happens with the would-be revolutionary character, who first of all is a child and not an adult thinker and an adult mover, um um and so, we as we talked about last week or the week before, you don't see representations of radical values, of revolutionary values, of successful the success of that and
Right.
what success means even in its own terms, all of these things coming together, but to the extent that, I'm really going back to this original point, the extent to which the masses, however popular in trend, anti-establishmentarianism and contrarianism becomes, if there's not ideological clarity and a kind of an understanding of the dynamics at play, then we, as we are doing now, stay caught up in the illusion, you know, that the so-called liberals are offering some kind of different agenda than the so-called conservatives, and or we're not really clear about what it is we're seeking, whether we're seeking, the piece of the rotten pie or systemic, systemic change, systemic overhaul, systemic,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. I don't know if people, how much people are clear, or maybe they are on what, they think is worth fighting for. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. The But yeah, for the longest, right? The just in terms of the culture industries, um, done everything they could to minimize, uh, any sorts of revolutionary representations. I mean, I think they're practically non-existent. Um,
Mm-hmm.
or it's sort of rechanneled into maybe some sort of criminality. Um, it's interesting though, as I was looking at it. So many of the kind of action hero type movies, there's so much kind of criminality, going on, just in terms of the property damage and you know uh, body counts, that these heroes may leave behind. Right? As I was watching a little bit of what was it, Jack Reacher last night, right? Tom Cruise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The yeah, the sort of that kind of vigilante character
Mm-hmm.
has been part of that character in that genre. I think at least since the '70s, going back, a couple of those movies that we mentioned weeks ago, particularly Death Wish, right? The vigilante
Mm-hmm.
um, Charles Bronson series.
Mm-hmm.
The But of course, it's not in their interest, right, to accurately represent anything revolutionary. And again, I don't know that they ever have, except in some type of caricature, right? And certainly not in a way that presents it as viable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think looking at Good Times, there at least one episode. Well, there are the many episodes that with the alderman who comes to visit the Evans, and who's clearly kind of a jackleg politician, um, corrupt, corrupt black politician, just
Mm-hmm.
mainly trying to get votes and whatnot. Um, and there is an episode with a young, energetic, progressive vision, young black politician, maybe trying to win that seat or something.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but again, though, the limits of the politics, right? Is through the electoral process, and there's the implication of community organizing, right? But ultimately, the thought is, you make change through the electoral process. And even the militant midget, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
Michael Evans,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, early on, I think, he declares that his ultimate goal is to become a Supreme Court justice like his hero Thurgood Marshall. right?
Mhm.
So, um,
Mhm.
from the very beginning of his militancy, right, the end
Mhm.
result is somehow assimilation and validation of the system, right, and the
Right.
exceptionalism of
Yeah. Mhm.
the United States, right, or this mythic
Mhm.
thing called America.
Mhm. Mhm.
The
Mhm.
but at least there it is there's some rupture during the period, right, and this changeover, right, this effort to represent a changing society, right, this sort of the some of the context of shows like the Mary Tyler Moore Show and the single woman living on her own, right, and
Mhm.
unmarried, um, on the pill. I mean, all these things, right, and
Mhm.
uh, divorced people, and um, interesting show that I always thought was a little um,
Mhm.
trippy, right, and
Mhm.
that makes that bridge from the 70s into the 80s just because of the sense of surveillance, right in
Mhm.
the title, the white shadow.
Mm. Which I never watched.
The white shadow, yes, the basketball coach, right, the white
Right.
basketball coach, just retired from the NBA, that teaches in the inner city school, that's somewhere at a crossroads inner city school, right, so
Mhm.
but mostly black students, some Latin students, a couple of
Mhm.
white students, at least one of whom would be Jewish. The
Mhm.
mostly working class, though, right? And um,
Mhm. Mhm.
the white shadow, though, this
Mhm.
level of surveillance culture, right? And embedded into it, and at least one episode where a wrongly incarcerated young man comes back to the school pissed, and the white shadow coach is warning everybody away from his radical commentary and analysis, right, et cetera, right, and actually, does he, maybe he's reformed by the end of the episode,
Mhm.
either reformed or rejected, one or the other, right,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, or otherwise open for parody, right, um, different kinds of shows, or absent, right, and um, like you said, we get into the 80s and it's the Huxtables, right, it's also the Reagan era, right, and
Mhm.
um, what is it, Morning in America again. I think that was the second campaign. The first one was the Make America Great Again one, right,
Mhm.
the and so the Huxtables were perfect, the kind of the economic, this
Yeah.
is the picture of acceptable
Yeah.
uh, black people. Uh,
Mhm.
you know, they've got white friends.
Mhm.
They have other professional black friends. Although I
Mhm.
have to say I'm at a disadvantage because I didn't watch it much.
Mhm.
I was just not interested in the Huxtables at all. Uh,
Mhm.
and their life was like, this is not the life of most black people.
Mhm.
And yes, it's popular because these are the black people, white people want to see,
Mhm.
want to
Mhm.
believe is true, want to believe that racism is over and all this type stuff, right? Um,
Mhm.
so doing that work, right, and that's a commonality, right, doing that work, presenting that narrative of black people living like white people, living like upper class
It's white people. Yeah.
affluent white people,
Right.
or living among white folks to some degree, if it's a working class situation, but not rarely black people on their own, maybe until we get to the what's his name's TV shows, Tyler Perry's stuff, the
Mhm.
Browns and all
Mhm.
that stuff, House
Mhm.
of Pain.
Which so interestingly, and that is something, part of the Tyler Perry phenomenon is that it is not a studio outward projection. You know, it was absolutely viable, alive, on its feet, you know, institution. You know,
Mhm.
those stories, the Medea stories, were already an
On the videotape,
institution.
right? Yeah.
Videotapes and, yeah, live theater in the
Mhm.
church circuit. It was, you know what I'm saying? It
Mhm.
was uh, something that was already cultivated, you know,
Mhm.
so it was, you know, easy to pluck and uh, transfer. You know what I mean? So it's just kind of
Mhm.
more like a, in my view, in my way of seeing at it, seeing it, which is not educated relative to you know, entertainment business and all, and how that's done and all these kinds of things. But um, you know, it was a ready-made following. You know, it was a really
Well,
ready.
Tyler Perry did that plucking, right?
Uh,
Tyler Perry did that plucking,
right,
right?
right,
Took
right,
that, took the proceeds of that
right,
grassroots
right,
accumulation, uh,
right. To
and
cross over. Yeah. Well,
in terms of being able to cross over, right,
yeah.
and get because it was content that was compatible, right, compatible with the colonizers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, um, you know, that erasure, because another thing
Mhm.
is in terms of the assimilation politic and the respectability politic, you know.
Mhm.
Um, and even what comes to mind is that oft cited, oft referred to co-opting of hip hop,
Mhm.
um, and you know, the resale of gangster rap,
Mhm.
and the, you know, what the erasing of resistance elements and dissent
Mhm.
elements, even
Mhm.
in gangster rap, you know, those kinds of
Mhm.
things that, you know, is kind of happening at the same time as the Huxtableization and the
Mhm.
you know, these other kinds of projections, which also has
Mhm.
a big market in for us, in, you know, in our communities. It's not only the black people that white people want to see, but the black people that black people want to see. You know,
Mhm.
we like to
Mhm.
imagine ourselves in these wealthy environs, and you know, we call it's in quite interesting psychology there. How much is invested in seeing in the symbolic arena, and how much is invested in uh, seeing black folk depicted in positions of wealth or political position, because it's really just positioning, but we call that progress. We tend
Mhm.
to
Well, for a long time,
equate.
it was just, can we see some black people, period. Right. And
Yeah,
just period. And
yeah.
then can we see some black people in some different kinds of roles, right?
Hmm.
Something other than the servant, right?
Right,
After, the mid
right.
60s, right?
And we have this kind of sensibility, that if it's as this kind of sensibility that what's, you know, in through that depiction, that this is representative of progress. If it's
Mm-hmm.
in the, you know, in the world of, in the visual world, in the world of the monitor, in the world of the screen, film, television, and whatnot, you know what I mean? It's somehow seen as substantial.
This is it, it is promoted as progress, right? This is, what is supposed to stand in as progress. And then the black press, reinforces that, right, by doing stories on these highly visible, black people who have particular roles in television for, the last 60 years or something like that, right?
Mhm,
That has been
mhm,
a practice in
mm,
the black press, right? And
Mm.
and the creation of black celebrity.
Hmm.
And that representation becomes part of the black celebrity. I mean, again, it's already happening in the mid 1960s, right? With I Spy, right? And Bill Cosby is who's Scotty Alexander, I think is the character, right? You got we mentioned her last time, Nichelle Nichols,
Mm-hmm.
Lieutenant Uhura.
Mm-hmm.
She's a lieutenant, right? She's the
Mm-hmm.
communications officer, right,
Mm-hmm.
on the Enterprise, and
Mm-hmm.
not a servant, as it were, right, but part of
Mm-hmm.
the man team. And um,
Mm-hmm.
them. So, oh yeah, what's his name? I think the character's name is Barney. I can't remember his last name, but Greg Morris, Mission
Mm-hmm.
Impossible, right? The technical engineering genius,
Mm-hmm.
right? The
Mm-hmm.
character played by Ivan Dixon. I can't remember. He's a sergeant already, right? But on what is it, Hogan's Heroes in the late '60s. The black sergeant, Kincaid, maybe. But
Maybe I
anyway,
remember him, and I
Ivan
watched
Dixon.
Hogan's Heroes as a little kid. I was a great consumer of Hogan's
Hogan's
Heroes.
Hero. So you remember, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Ivan Dixon's character, the black sergeant.
If I saw him, I would remember it,
Yeah,
but
you would
it's
remember.
not at the forefront. Go
Um,
ahead. Yeah.
and where again, though, he plays like the communications genius, right? The
Right.
technical genius, the most cerebral in the group, right? The most
Right.
serious in the group in a way.
Right.
So there's already something being established like that in the '60s, um,
Mm-hmm.
but again, in each case, they're individuals operating in a white milieu for the most part, right? And that's going to continue to be the case until I think something like Good Times comes on, because even the Jeffersons, right, their neighbors is a mixed couple, right,
Mm-hmm.
and then the English guy, right, are their neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so even and of course they're living uptown now, so they're in effect no longer in the black community, right? So which they
Mm-hmm.
weren't in the first place because they were Archie Bunker's neighbors
Mm-hmm.
in Queens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's already well established. And
Mm-hmm.
do we ever? I don't know. Again, I didn't watch enough of the Cosby Show. I guess in some so the spinoff from the Cosby Show, A Different World, is a primarily black space. Its first year, Marissa Tomei plays a white student at the historically black college, right? But then she's replaced. She's only there for the first year, and I don't think maybe another white character comes in. I not that I because I was
Mm-hmm.
wasn't watching it all the time, but by
Mm-hmm.
that time my children were watching it with some regularity a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
This story about young black people at college, and
Mm-hmm.
it was interesting. But again, very uh, in some ways only incidentally black. I, I think you might say.
Yeah.
And the character, what I forget her name.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to blank on the
Mm-hmm.
actress's name,
What are you
Jasmine,
talking about? Mm-hmm.
who played the character Whitney.
Mm-hmm.
She could have been any Southern belle, right?
Mm-hmm.
That character, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so all that to say the die has been established. So by the time we get to the 2000s to 2010s, all the various shows that have been coming up on all the various channels, I mean
Mm-hmm.
that's there's a black or two persons in the ensemble cast,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and that continues to really remain. Parks and Recreation was interesting because we went with one black character and one a South Asian character, right, to
Mm-hmm.
cover
Mm-hmm.
the ethnic range, right? And um, what is the other one? The Office, right? Went with
Yeah.
uh, what's his name, Stanley.
Yeah.
I actually, what was he a salesperson in The Office? I don't know what Stanley was actually doing.
He was a, yeah, I think Stanley was a
He
salesperson,
was
and then there
also
was the
sales.
yeah.
And then you had the Craig Robinson's character Daryl, right down,
Right.
working, who eventually comes upstairs. But the
Right.
same pattern, again, it's the same pattern mostly in every case.
Yeah.
Black people among white people. And to
Yeah.
varying degrees,
Yeah.
they may bring in something black about, themselves and the culture, but it's ultimately, black people among white people.
Mhm.
And a particular kind of vision of America, right? And
Mhm.
Americanism
Mhm.
that is being
Mhm.
promoted. That is still too much beyond the pale for these reactionaries, right? That we're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, it's doing the work of trying to maintain the system, right?
Mhm.
Create a narrative of the fundamental goodness of the characters and the system itself, and not really bringing anything into question, right? Under
No.
in these personal quirks of people, right? And,
Right. Right. Um, never that, never that. In the same is I think can be said to be true of the broader field of just representation in the land of
mhm,
film and
mhm.
television. You don't see the working class, you don't
Yeah, the
see
working class.
the working poor, you don't see the non-working poor. Um, of any group, and when those non-working poor are shown, it's usually us pathologized,
Yeah.
um, or in particular ways, um, if it's a pathology of Latinx folk, more the what the gangster trope and the gangster
Mhm,
gang member trope was made its
mhm.
splash with us, right, in the 90s, in the early 90s or whatnot, but I think it's fair to say that, prior to that and, surrounding that, our favorite pathology trope was the, single mother welfare, uh, and
Mhm,
or drug addiction kind of representation, and the
mhm,
people in poverty that you see are the white rural poor who are very much after Nancy Eisenberg's, uh, uh, explanation of the invisibilized of the invisibilization of the white underclass and uh the white poor and the whole concept of white trash.
mhm.
So these are the people who are um, saddled with uh, acceptable characterizations of idiocy and buffoonery and all of these. It's acceptable to have these kinds of stereotypical representations who are saddled with they take the blame and the brunt for for white terrorist violence, and whatnot. These are you know, always the repetition of the notion, that the Klansman is the person. What is it? What Bubba, right? Bubba with one tooth
Mhm,
and a
mhm,
beer belly and all, just all of that, all the bullshit.
mhm, mhm.
And so I guess there was a period where you would occasionally see white poverty. But for the most part, all of this is really to say you don't see poverty. You don't see
That's
people,
very
you don't
rare.
see, very rare that you see poverty, very rare that you see people working. You don't see
Mhm.
working class people. You see uh uh what upper echelon professionals,
Right, exactly. It
never
depends
the
on the work.
mention of a
Exactly.
financial issue. There are
Mhm.
people, these are
I mean,
people
you get to see police at work, so to speak, right?
you'll
And
see police at
you
work.
get to see lawyers at work.
Right,
You
right,
know, there's the whole
right,
CSI thing. You get to see the technicians at work, right?
right, right,
But yeah,
right.
that you don't get to see the everyday people. Their work is being interrupted in a scene or something like that.
Yeah, you know? Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So the stories, human drama and the morality plays that we see and whatever is the important drama,
Hmm.
of the day, the important drama to understand, right, is played out against a background of affluence and wealth and
Hmm.
extraordinary affluence
Right,
and wealth, actually,
right. Because
and
that is the eagle ideal of the culture.
the absolutely the ideal of the culture. And also it's interesting to me that because if you made a film uh situated in working class and barely working class, etc., poverty itself, bill paying, bill paying and ends meeting itself would be a character, an ever
Hmm.
present part of the
Hmm.
discussion and the script, you know
Hmm.
um while other human drama is unfolding, you know,
Yeah.
while human drama is unfolding. But in the, in the films that we see, in the stories that we see, there's, money is no money is no object.
Typically, it isn't. I mean, those movies are out there, right? They're, but they're rare, right? They're not the. I mean, they're independent filmmakers, maybe, making those, or yeah. I mean, there are even the people who are supposed to be poor in a lot of those movies, they somehow are not living. They have money for gas. I mean, there's something,
Right, right.
or they're criminals, right?
Not
Or they're
affected by
procuring
right,
money through criminal purposes, and
right.
yeah, it's just not.
Mm,
What is shown, even when the characters are supposed to be working class. You know,
mhm,
public service announcements, right? That's where you see the poor, right? Public service announcements. Um,
right,
so
right,
those kind of specialized uh,
right.
presentations, maybe the news. Well, maybe particular kinds of so-called reality television, just highly edited, right? It's not cinema verite. The You'll see, we see the poor, right? See the poor on cops for years, right? The
Mhm,
um, whether black,
mhm,
white, whatever, right? The
mhm,
stereotype of the guy running down the street with no shirt on,
mhm,
or drunk, right?
mhm,
That's where you see the poor and those types
mm,
of
mm,
um, that those types of representations, that again fit the narrative, right? That somehow the poor are responsible for their poverty.
mhm,
They don't work hard enough. They aren't like us, the
mhm,
normal people. Um,
mhm,
you know, and yeah, so it's rare, and you don't see the kind of everyday anxiety people live with, right? And unless
mm,
you've seen it, and again, in this very particularized way where it's being pathologized,
mhm,
you know, TV show, cop show, right, where
mhm,
you might see the poor in a cop show.
mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
folks are drinking 40s or
yeah,
strung out crack or etc. Right, and it's
yeah.
not safe. Or when it is a narrative of escape, right, and this diamond in the rough who needs to get out of the neighborhood through whatever special talent, whatever it
Right,
is that makes them exceptional.
right,
Their effort, to get out of the
right,
neighborhood,
right,
um,
right, right.
or maybe in a situation where the genre is fantasy or science fiction. So it's already dealing with the kind of unreality. And I think, that comes to mind as I just thought of the characters in Dirk Bentley and the Holistic Detective Agency.
Mhm, mhm,
But again, it's in the realm of comedy and fantasy, right?
mhm.
As you're looking at, some working class characters, right? And
Mhm.
lower middle class care, because even the working class, and that was, I told you before coming on, I was watching a lecture that Gabriel Rockhill gave about a month and a half ago And he mentions, right, that we, when we think about the working class, we got to remember how it's stratified, right? Various types of workers in the working class, and but so again, where do you see that? And even these cop shows, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's a working class job, right?
Right.
Um, where do you see that? Again, it's in the context of a fantasy comedy program, and often that's where working class families, when there is working class,
Right. It's
uh,
comical.
it's comedy, right? That it's laughable. It's basically what's being said. It's not normal life, and again, the example of Good Times, which still to this day may have been the most representative black family ever on television, just in terms of being, working class, right? And
Hmm.
work and together, right, as a family.
Yeah.
The Which again was insisted upon first by Esther Roll, right? That the character have a husband,
Hmm.
regardless of again what the
Hmm.
producers think black families are, right?
Right.
The
Right.
But that whole, the whole trajectory of that series is the march toward middle class stability that they
Hmm.
achieved, right? That they
Right.
achieved in
Right.
this finale episode. Now,
Right.
what does that mean? So they're achieving middle class stability
Hmm.
in the early 80s. Now, what does that mean in the Reagan era and the thorough establishing of the neoliberal order, right? What is
Hmm.
that going to ultimately mean to that black
Hmm.
family living in the suburbs in Chicago or in and near Chicago
Hmm.
by the end?
Hmm. Hmm.
And what
Yeah.
does it mean also in terms of the fantasy level, right?
Hmm.
Um, One of the reasons I like to watch the animated series for adults, right? The Simpsons, um, the Seth MacFarlane genre, Oov, and even South Park, right? Because they can be more honest in the unreality of animation. They can
Yeah.
be more honest about the character of the society, as opposed to
Absolutely.
live action television or
Yeah.
whatever, where again these black people
Yeah.
operating in these primarily white spaces, it's as if racism does not exist. It's
Hmm.
complete fantasy, right?
Hmm.
In this, it's as if sexism barely exists, and when
Barely.
it comes out, it's boyish or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
not violent,
Not
not
violent, exactly.
intrusive, not oppressive. It's some kind. Yeah. That's
Right.
boyish is a great description. Um, and so yes, everything reducing to one or another. And there's, other genre of film, but like for instance, I was thinking about the public cause genre of film, um, particularly the uh, uh, Poisonous Chemical Corporation,
Mhm.
film, the violation and contamination and class action suit and the champion uh, uh, upper class hero, you know,
Mhm.
that saves one or another
Mhm.
lower working class community
Mhm.
from the abuses of a nefarious corporation, usually based
Mhm.
on true stories.
Usually based on a true story.
True
That's
story
right.
based on a
That's
true
right.
story. It's like, yeah. Um, but this other effect of everything reducing to um, pursuit and achievement of middle class of let me come out of that language of material comfort and stability.
Mhm. Mhm.
I was reading this article I was telling you about. Um, Let me get the title of it. Coming from MIT Press.
Mhm.
Name of the A Brief History of Consumer Culture,
Mm.
and it's really a great article. And the one of the first points, kind of like orienting points that it makes, was that the essential to the cultivation of a consumer culture was selling the sale was the idea of um, uh, participating, changing class, right?
Mhm.
Participating in,
The upward mobility of consumerism.
yeah, the upward mobility of consumerism, that in essence, the ability to acquire luxury items, right,
Mhm.
is in essence the changing of class, you know?
Right. It's the sign of one's
Yeah,
class ability, I guess, if you want to
class
ask.
ability,
Right,
which
yeah.
leads to a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
You ask people, everybody says, "Well, I guess I'm middle class," you know?
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
article talks about the concoction of the invention of the installment plan
Mhm.
payment, everything,
Mhm.
organized around, the lower level workers' ability to, cycles of payment,
Yeah.
and the levels of the wages and all of these kinds, all these things, very,
Mhm.
very
Mhm.
specifically calculated, very specifically
Right.
calculated.
These
But
are
that
not
whole
haphazard sort of, let the market do what it will type thing. They are
precisely,
quite orchestrated and planned.
precisely, highly
Mhm.
orchestrated. And
Mhm.
against this, and when you talk about the neoliberal the neoliberal um, um, doctrine, nothing new, but this the notion of the free hand, the
Mhm.
invisible,
Mhm.
holy, mystical
Right, right. The
hand
mystifying.
of the
Yeah,
market. Yes,
right.
and which, that will solve all ills and all, and all of that. Um, and that the hand is, not at all free. It's a marionette hand.
Mhm.
It's a
Mhm.
very, a very calculated process. And so, the article is essentially talking about the very self-conscious process,
Mhm.
a very clear a very clear, sociologically sophisticated, like,
Mhm.
process of cultivating desire, of cultivating want, of
Cultivating
cultivating,
desire.
organized around, right, creating these needs to acquire these things that give folk the sensibility of
Mhm.
being in a different class, being a
In
member of the of the powerful class,
As opposed to their actual material conditions and material relationships to.
Yes, right, as opposed to, right, so this is why, like, when we go to the, where do we go? This is many years ago, and it was, the enclave of Black people, contemplating gentrification and feeling that, you we went to that community kind of
Oh,
conversation
that event, that particular conversation about
that where
gentrification,
that
yeah.
yeah, where that conversation was taking place. I'm not naming it, because
Mhm.
it can be a
That
conversation
was a neighborhood council
taking
meeting.
place anywhere. It can be a
Right,
conversation
yeah.
taking place anywhere among any, community of bourgeois Black folk who mistakenly believe themselves to be a member a member of some kind of
Mhm.
self, I don't know, self sustaining class, or that, you know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? And it is precisely this
That, yeah, you don't know the
acquisition
difference between a petty bourgeoisie and the actual bourgeoisie.
and the actual bourgeoisie. And, it's precisely this sense of acquisition that
Hmm.
informs this sense of separateness and
Yeah,
aboveness,
and the
and
ability, that ability, yes.
a sense of being in a part of a different class, and
Hmm.
not the least of which is the uh, acquiring of certain kinds of professional degrees and certain so
Not being poor.
the not be yeah
But people don't even use the term working class. Right?
d-
That's
not even using not even
not
using
even
that
used,
class.
right? It's not
Yeah,
just not being poor, not being low class or underclass, and you don't even hear you don't even hear the term underclass, right?
because you
Really,
so rarely hear the term class.
because you're so only when you hear the word
When you
middle
hear
class.
only when you
That's
hear and only when
and
you
and
hear
it's and everybody's middle
right,
class, and
everybody's
indeed
middle
that's a
class.
favorite description of the country, particularly by liberals, a middle class country, right?
Right, right.
With no real conversation that, well, if it's the middle, what's on the other two sides?
Rides.
You know, just
Right,
conversation
right,
doesn't come up.
right.
Well, it's been coming up lately, right?
Yeah,
As
yeah,
oligarchy has become a more well known term, and that is thanks to Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio Cortez.
yeah.
But yeah, you otherwise don't hear that. It's interesting as you were. I was reminded. I can't remember his name. Who
Mhm,
the writer off the top of my head.
mhm,
And he was actually talking about France, right? Modern France. But there was a pattern. And France, where there is a clear notion of social class, right?
mhm,
That
mhm.
there was a pattern that was recognizable in the research, that families tended to either subscribe to or read magazines and journals that were like aspiring to the class above them, right?
Interesting.
So if you were working class, you were reading so-called middle class, professional type, magazines,
Mhm.
etc. And
Right.
of course, I immediately thought of the people who read or used to read Ebony or
Yeah,
even Essence, right? Who
right.
typically, and again, Black people in this country are overwhelmingly what we would call working class, right?
Mhm,
Yeah, overwhelmingly,
mhm,
even those with degrees and whatnot. And maybe
mhm,
at a particular strata of the working class, but workers.
mhm,
But yeah, I couldn't help but think of that that, yeah, reading this kind of
mm,
as class aspirational literature,
mm,
that it keeps you tied
mhm,
in,
mhm.
right, through a practice of through what substitutes for a practice of citizenship through
Mhm,
this consumer
mhm,
this consumerism,
mhm,
um,
mhm,
which again
mhm,
is completely
mhm,
tied to
mm,
the culture industries, right, and
mhm,
particularly and really thinking in terms of mass media, film, radio, and television, especially radio and television, and especially television, and then all this televisual technology post television, um,
mhm,
to construct its audience as consumers, right? Brought to you
mhm,
by,
mhm,
what was it,
mhm,
the DuPont Theater, right? Back
mm,
in what they call the golden age of television, often.
mm,
The brought to you by
mhm,
that private, for profit, ultimately, model, um, which, is just another layer of, or rather than layer, like another, um, yeah, I guess layer is right, of wall, right,
mhm,
between, um, people's and people understanding, the kind of real relationships that they have with the society at large, um, beginning at a time when union membership was high, right? And there was a sense of, of social class that
Mhm.
is slowly eroded, right? Again, that term domesticated in
Mm,
60s, the 70s,
mm,
by the 80s, practically gone. And also through using different kind of popular culture forms, and just this kind of discourse of the corruption of the unions, right? Um,
mhm.
the
Mhm.
corruption of the unions,
Mhm. Mhm.
their role as
Mhm.
ways that gangsters um,
Absolutely.
launder money, etc. Right?
Mobsters
Again,
and the last
exactly.
being
This
the
way of discrediting unions. Um,
yes.
that took hold, though. Just as
Mhm.
the anti civil rights stuff, the how dare you question white supremacy stuff, how dare you question male supremacy,
Yeah.
etc. Right?
Yeah.
Um, that took hold, just and the anti-union stuff took hold, so that so many members of the working class become their own worst enemies in these elections and are
Mm.
willing, shock troops,
Yeah.
or economic draftees to the various branches of the military.
Yeah, the hard sale, and everybody's linked into these mediations, these tightly controlled mediations of
Hmm.
information, of idea, of
Hmm.
creating and recreating this the American myth world,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
um, um so very so unbeknownst so
Hmm.
unbeknownst. Um, you were
The
talking
American myth world. I like that. Yeah.
um you were talking a few beats back about folks reading uh magazines essentially uh that are in a class
Hmm.
range and like
Or at
a
least looking at the
step up,
pictures, right? At
huh?
least looking at the pictures.
At least looking at the pictures. I mean, and there is
Mhm.
that sensibility.
Mhm.
There's a difference between glamour and Vogue.
Right,
There's a difference between, you know what I
right.
mean? And if you're
Mhm.
reading Sunset magazine, that implies a certain locale of a certain
Mhm.
kind of class, of people living a luxury life, the life of leisure,
The
of
life of leisure.
travel, never
Yes.
mind Condé Nast, what the,
Right.
what
Yeah.
is that? Who is that? Condé
Mm.
who? You know?
Right. Yeah.
And um, but there's definitely that sensibility, which made me think about um how that nicheification of print culture, of magazine culture, and how that even becomes not even becomes, but the way that is a uh such a powerful market development tool, and
Mhm.
are able to what is it? I'm thinking about like mosquitoes and the creatures that have the little thing that penetrates into the flesh so it can suck,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, to, penetrate into a particular pool that with a cultivated identity, even like, the the teen identity, the concept of, who
Right.
teens are and what they're interested in and how to be, and all these kinds of things. And obviously, yeah, the industries, the much discussed industries around young women and uh, beauty industry and all of that,
Mhm.
niche upon niche, and each of them an ever,
Mhm.
all generating endless needs within
Mhm.
the niche, you know.
Mhm.
Even in, I don't know how popular it is, continues to be, but thinking about what popular mechanics, you know, there's definitely things to be sold there. Definitely things to
Right,
be
yeah,
sold. You
yeah.
know, items
They
to
have
be sold.
sponsors,
The
and, you know,
DIY dad.
if
Yeah.
you exactly, and when you go to that hardware store or that auto store, and you, yeah, I
Right.
remember that ad. I remember their ad, and
Yeah.
I looked them up. Yeah, exactly, right. And
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
mean, this
The
everything for
household
sale,
name.
right? Everything for sale.
Yes.
It is the economy.
Yes.
And which again, people, even there, people every now and then
Mm,
realize their power, your
mm.
power of withholding, your dollar, um, your, questioning whether this implanted desire, right? That this thing you actually don't need, and why do you have to want it, right? And I
Yes.
mean, we're seeing that now, as the numbers keep coming out and the boycott is working, right? Target and some of these other
Yeah.
folks are feeling
Yeah.
it, right? Certainly Tesla is feeling it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and Costco is doing so well that some of these congressional Republicans are calling for them to be investigated for their DEI practices and
Oh,
discrimination, right?
that's so
But that
sick.
shows that is, that just demonstrates their effectiveness, right? Or the
Yes.
effectiveness of this selective
Let me
use
get
of
my damn
people,
Costco card. Yeah.
spending, right?
Yeah.
That when people get organized, they can make a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And we can resist these narratives. We can find so there are alternatives, and even where the attitude might primarily be reform, more radical visions still get through.
Mhm.
Uh, and this has been the importance, and again, why it's always been under attack, and especially now, um, of uh, of public broadcasting, right? Of
Mhm.
PBS, where there isn't a profit motive, right? They don't have to make money, as such, right? Now, I know there, post Reagan, there were changes to PBS, right, where there are these corporate sponsors to different shows, right, and they do their little brought to you by
Mhm.
thing that used to not
Mhm.
be there, but it's still a far cry, right, from your typical commercial television, right?
Absolutely. Mhm.
The where you could get some of these other narratives, right? You could get some of these
Huh.
a show like American Masters, right, which has the
Yeah.
nice patriotic name, right,
Yeah.
American Masters,
Yeah.
but many of the folks, right, that they might be covering, right, have some very pointed critiques of U.S. history and experience, and but
Mhm.
I think Billie Holiday is one of those. Lorraine
Mhm.
Hansberry. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm mixing up American Masters with Voices and Vision. I wanted to say Walt Whitman, but no.
Mhm.
But I'm pretty sure Mark Twain. Just folks who would otherwise be dissidents, right? Um, what is that? They have that series Point of View, POV,
Mhm.
where some very um, can even say radical visions are shared by some independent filmmakers, right? And
Mhm.
the production company California Newsreel,
Mhm. Mhm.
their work has
Mhm.
appeared, right, PBS,
Mhm.
and the kind of work that has been made possible because of grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National
Mhm.
Endowment for the Arts, right? Uh,
Mhm.
Not always politically popular work,
Mhm.
but our places, our
Mhm.
representations that get
Mhm.
a chance to sneak through. I
Mhm.
think I think Marlon Riggs's
Mhm.
Ethnic Notions, I think, appeared on
Mhm.
PBS. What, the Colored Museum, uh,
Mhm.
PBS version, right? And
Mhm.
many more,
Mm.
right?
Right.
Biographies of socialists, right? Or biographies of people including their socialism, like maybe an Albert
Right.
Einstein, or
Right.
what's her name?
Biographies of people that include their
Yeah,
socialism.
yes.
Absolutely. Yes.
So those things sneak through, right?
Yeah.
The audience isn't as large, right? And it's
Yeah.
always under attack. Um,
Mhm.
but they make their way through, right? They make their way
Mhm.
through on public radio, both
Mhm.
the NPR style public radio, the local college stations. Uh,
Mhm.
the if there happens if the local, um, well, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, it's at the college station. So like a
Mhm.
KCRW at Santa Monica College, or
Mhm.
what is it, KPCC at Pasadena City College.
Mhm.
These things, and then there is I actually only know of the one network, right?
Mhm.
Right? Pacifica
Mhm.
Network, right, where you could at least get some,
Mhm.
you can get some breakthrough
Mhm.
relative to the mass media, corporate media. They're small audiences, but they're often quality audiences, you might say, right?
Mhm.
Active audiences.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so those things break through, and that's why they're constantly under
Mm.
attack. And efforts are being made to strangle, isolate, silence, obscure, marginalize those voices.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
But they
Yeah.
matter, right? They matter,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and are worth fighting for. They're important.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're important. The So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're at about a half an hour and a half. I should say.
We're at an hour and a half. We've put in an hour and a half, and I think that's good. I think
I think
that's
so too.
enough for someone who wants to tap in to digest,
Yeah, yeah,
to
we
get
can
into.
close in on that. Do you want to come back to the consumerism some more next week?
I would like to. I would like to. I think it's really worth talking about because it's such a
Mhm.
feature of the landscape. You know what I mean?
It has everything to
It's
do with
so
these culture industries.
naturalized. Yes,
Yes, exactly.
it is so naturalized and so insidious.
It's
It's
been
in the
such an important
dictionary.
part
It's the
of
picture in the dictionary under insidious. Huh?
it's such a critical part of the counterinsurgency, right? And this is it's part of what so as you were talking about, the sale, right? The
Mhm.
selling, the
Mhm.
selling things to us, and that includes, I was thinking of, as besides thinking about the magazine thing, I was thinking of, yeah, including selling the ability to buy these things through this
Mm.
thing called credit, right? Being able to get credit becomes a sign of that sort of class
Right.
mobility, which then
Absolutely.
allows you to purchase these things,
Ah,
but really going into debt, right? So
into
you're making
debt.
yourself a debt slave.
It
Yeah.
is just
So yeah, it's where and it's completely tied in with these for-profit culture industries and
yes.
the shape they have taken in the United States, and what and the places in the world where that has been mimicked. Um, yeah. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm with. So we can, yeah,
Yeah.
consumerism,
Let's
right?
dig
And
into that.
um,
Yeah.
why people are promoting things like, why buying power, right, becomes
These
such an
concepts,
important,
yeah.
as Jared Ball says, the myth and propaganda of
Yeah.
black buying power and all the other various buying powers, right?
Right.
You hear that
Right.
gay buying power, right? You hear
Right.
that a lot. Um,
Yes. The
the,
notion of a
yeah,
buying
yeah,
power
yes, buying power, right? And
in
just
the
the
way
general
others.
middle class buying power, right?
Right.
This whole notion, so tied into commercial television in particular,
Yeah.
um, and
Yeah.
commercial radio, right? So
Not
yeah,
boycott power,
not
buying
boycott,
power.
Buying power, exactly.
Mhm.
Because and we'll give you credit so you can buy.
So you can buy.
We will
Wow.
sell you credit, really, so you can
Right. We will sell you credit cheap.
cheap. Yeah, yeah. At first, anyway.
Yeah.
So, any final comments you want to make?
No final comments. No big final, I always have something to say. No
Yeah.
big final comments. Just yeah, this is a what in the movie cycle, the final conflict. I don't know how
Mm,
final conflict it is, but this is definitely an era of pitched battle,
yes.
between these amongst these differing, power brokers, and
Mhm.
a grand opportunity to, as they sharpen the contradictions, is it,
Yeah.
as they make these contradictions so stark and so poignant and so, as they are so oppressive and gross. It is a teachable moment. I wish nobody pain and suffering, you know what I mean? And there's no kind of glib that we heard all of the in things such as the what non no commitment, the no commitment movement, and
Mhm.
all of these kinds of things, and just let it all go to shit. It's like, well, that's people's lives. Talking about it going to shit,
Right. Right.
Um, and, you know, um, it is definitely a time when people are asking a lot of questions. They are open to more profound explanations, and the things are right up there in your face to be seen. This, that. This, that. It's not, not submerged. So glad to, as we always say, be doing this part and contributing in this way to
Mhm.
an conversation,
Yeah.
important conversation.
Well, with that, um, let me take a minute to shout us out. Um, last Saturday we had our inaugural People's Mic, right? Another way we're trying to contribute. And, considering the hiccups we faced, it was quite a success and the energy was high, and the resistance is spirited in this moment. Um, so we're going to do it again and we'll keep y'all posted on that, especially if you're in the LA area. Um, and then also, we want to say please like this video on YouTube. Please subscribe to our channel. And by all means, please share. If you're on Facebook watching this, please do the
Mm.
same. Right? Uh, get the word out, help us grow. We're trying to get a word out to folks, right? And um, in this moment.
Yes.
So, with that, we will say good night to y'all, folks, and see you next week. And we'll pick up the conversation, particularly looking at this issue of consumerism and the way in which we have been constructed as consumers, which is in some ways the ultimate um, victory of the reaction, right? Or of the ruling class, right, to keep us complicit in our
Mm.
own oppression.
Mhm, mhm.
But you know, uh, we're also in the process of creating this new world. There's reason for hope. The American empire is coming to an end. And like all empires, when they come to an end, it gets harder in the center, right? It gets harder in the metropole. So they're, turning those energies toward us, and the resistance is resolute. Um, so let's stay that way. And I'll end with again from Bob Marley: Revelation reveals the truth. It takes a revolution to make a solution. Peace, y'all.